Hello there. I would like to discuss philosophy today and include this piece, the dialectical self-concept of symbolic being, which is a book I had self-published on September 16th, 2018, and the reason I am getting to it just now is that I would like to clarify a certain number of distinctions that exist within the work itself. And though the work is not itself a manifesto that has to do with the economy per se, a lot of the philosophical content addresses Marx's notion of exchange value. And it also addresses the idea of use value, and it approaches those topics in terms of what for people could be a philosophy of mind and tie into notions that have to do with economic determinism, the structures or absence of structures in government or private corporations and things of this nature, and how essentially we orient ourselves as economic beings in terms of whether we feel we have legally been violated or not violated by the institutions themselves, which are in this piece are demonstrated as hegemonic capitalist structures. Now, since this was written between 2014 and 2018, I believe a lot of the hegemonic capitalist structures of which I have spoken have been essentially eradicated to a large degree, but there's always the chance that they return, and I think this identifies with the possibility of that happening somewhere down the road. It is definitely a piece that is most notably part of the lexicon of work that occurred during the 2010s. It is definitely part of that, but it has a very Centurion aspect to it in that it attempts to do something which I believe has been tried by other people, is to take a phenomenology and address it under the rubric of sort of a Marxist discipline as to how it is addressed, phenomenological aspects. So what we have here is we have the essential idea that when you are dealing with yourself, your body, and I'm now reading Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work after I read him much earlier on in my life, and seeing that it has developed in a very different way the phenomenological aspect of Marxism. He is perchance a Husserlian Marxist, and I am very different than this in that I feel that subjectivity generates what I call the symbolic reality of existence, which, as it has been discovered, finds its place oftentimes more in sociology or social psychology than it does in philosophy. That we are represented to one another aesthetically, and based upon the cultural differentiations between subject and object, that is myself, and the object, which is the experience of perhaps a sphere of some sort in the mind that identifies with has something to do with the world itself, is broken down into component parts that fall into the categories of the social, the political, the economic, the aesthetic, the semiotic, and ultimately, as well, there is the field of course, for Merleau-Ponty, of cultural anthropology and the blends of all of those, sociology and social psychology and socioeconomic theory, and all of these sort of transform the way one responds to the stimuli happening. And I will say that I feel the economy has taken a real downturn in activity, and though the stock market didn't crash, there was no great crisis at the end of the 2010s, but I feel that there was a function of some sort of erasure. I think possibly for a younger generation, they would have found they are starting fresh, and the collective consciousness would be, this is new, this is all happening now. But it's really quite different than for me. In another book I wrote called Contemporary Elucidations in Thought, Hegel and Schopenhauer's Millennial Age, I'm discussing the idea of the Y2K scare, and how I feel that human beings were wiped of their memories rather than computers were. And it's interestingly enough, to think that computers would be wiped of their memories and people sort of being experiencing this psychoanalytic notion of erasure would have something to do with the way institutions, both private and public, are able to impose upon a subject a way of living, a manner of behaving, the sense of conduct, and appealing to the senses of people, rather than going on within the auspices of the notion of sensibility, which is so important to a lot of the content of this book, which is part of the sort of Kantian vision, as well as the Husserlian. And I will go so far as to say that I believe that if you read Kant, Critique of Pure Reason, to jump around between topics, you will find a lot of, in essence, some Marxism in there. If you've spent a lot of time with the book Critique of Pure Reason, you will start to see that this idea of materialist idealism is what really sort of tipped the scales for Marx in inverting Hegel at some point. The idea that substance is something that is movable, is something that is it's even in Aristotle that substance can be moved. It's thought of as in the private sector as a way of sort of buying and selling the commodity form of human attributes. They call it commoditizing people. So you simply take the substance of someone and you essentially sort of, what they also call it monetizing. You monetize them and then you sell it, and that person doesn't receive any payment for it. So what is functional to being a Marxist at some point is the idea that you own your own substance and you possess it. So to add to it the notion that you would also be an aesthetic being, a being that perceives their consciousness as really an inversion of Marxism, the idea that, as is contained in this piece, an inversion of Marxism, as Adorno did, a reflexive inversion of an inversion. So you have Marx going into the state in the 20th century with the establishment of the Soviet Union, and you have Marx coming back, and you have the individual beginning to establish their own rights in terms of the ownership of their substance, and their owning the means of production, owning their product, owning their object. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that is with publishing your own book does to you is, though you don't have the same sort of vetting process, I think that already, because you've taken responsibility for for making sure that you read all the necessary texts, the applicable texts that allow you to compose a work, manufactures some sort of a priori, before experience, concept of how it can actually apply to a vision that would be part of a collective aspiration. Now, in this piece, there is an appendix to it, Appendix A, and it is essentially on something I called a notion that I think sort of surreptitiously or perhaps by happenstance, thinking of Derrida, the idea that a philosophy of language would have the notion of deconstructionism in it, so that would apply to something ontological, that using language as the signifier contained within a text that could be worked on and developed so as to demonstrate factual data in a different way. So what I've seen is, I'm not building upon the work of Derrida, but I am what I call is a destructuration. Destructuralism is what I'm calling this notion, and destructuralism is essentially the idea that what happens once everything has been emancipated into individual multiplicities of especially with the idea of identity politics and the administration of a totalization of independence from any determinations that it might exist psychosocially by way of which the economy is either private or public or whatever determines someone to identify in a certain way, eventually becomes constitutive of something that is governed in a way. And and especially economic activity, when it's governed in such a way as it becomes what I call an emancipatory structure. And this emancipatory structure becomes something that enters superstructure, and it is no longer perfectly valid to just utilize the deconstruction of language of the facts in order to arrive at a solution to it. So this is not an aggressive dialectical maneuver to destructurate, as I call it. I believe Ernesto Laclau has something in his philosophy in the book Emancipations that is close to this. The idea that an emancipated self is such that it becomes in the sort of vertical adjudication of what is applying to your own subjectivity, and where representations become vertical instantiations of the self or the other. When it has no religious signification to it, as it might have to someone that is practicing a religion, it might become problematic to someone. So the other point in this piece, the dialectical self-concept of symbolic being, is it has the basic notion of the essentialist notion, really. I am guilty of essentialism, I have to say, since I am seeking the idea that on the horizon exists an essence for everyone that has a substantive claim to their own self-identification. And that is a process whereby someone is able to be ontologically self-identical to what they are in their own nature. So there is the distinction made, yet a synthesis made, between the transcendental and the natural. I believe here I have perhaps breached certain categorizations in the discipline of philosophy between the idea that something is produced by nature or is transcendental. But I believe I've solved it with the idea of the transcendental identical, which is a non-visual representation of the other, which is also identical. And the only other philosopher I've found since I had come up with the the transcendental identical had been Roy Basquiat. Now, the essence of the transcendental identical is not the essence of this book. The essence of this book is really hedging upon the idea that when one is presented with an object, one has a decision to make whether or not one believes this object is the self. And it's been addressed throughout the history of philosophy. That thought and being are two separate components of the psyche. Thoughts are generated by the self, and being is generated by the self as well, but thoughts are sometimes generated by the other. But if should being as the object of the self be generated by the other, one becomes enters a situation where the critical evaluation of self comes into scrutiny. Now, between the private and the public, we have the notion of dialectic, in essence. As what you have within the horizontal system of thought, systemization of thought, you have subjectivity as the self existing on one side of an argument, any point of argumentation. Then you have all things that are produced, all things that exist as such. Now, why do you have all things that exist? Why is there this totality? Because I believe that the thoughts of the subject generate what might be conceived by the totality. It's what might be part of the notion of totality. But when one begins to consider this notion, one begins to realize that with the immediacy of both the private and public economy, things becoming more public because of obvious technological developments, there is an opening to public spaces that creates the necessity for a private adjudication of the way things are distributed economically. And bioeconomically is the situation whereby bioeconomics is a field in which I posit the idea that things such as medicine, the health of the individual to be, the well-to-do, we have Brexit coming, and you have the notion of being well-to-do having to do with this notion of bioeconomics that I believe people call biological economics. That has to do with how you're able to function in a universality whereby you have all sorts of particular forms of contagion and things of this notion that can arrive, all sorts of choices that are part of the subject's life that are articulated within the notion of universality, that cluster into an enormous sort of phenomenon that is difficult for anyone to handle. So this is usually, in bioeconomics, this is usually handled in this field whereby one is able to distinguish, or biotechnology or biogenetics, largely biotechnology, that one is able to apply certain agents to the biochemistry of individuals and allow them to function better in this sort of universality of proposed in Canada by universal healthcare, proposed. It's still, after all these years, it is still singularly a proposition that is not entirely fused with the reality of the way one should administrate healthcare. And I would be in perhaps in a little bit of a quarrel with someone that suggested that the healthcare system were perfect. It's one of the best in the world, but it's, I would say, from the standpoint of universality preceding consciousness, if we can accept this idea that something universal precedes the subjectivity of an individual in a situation where you have a nation state, I think you can propose that that would be the goal of every nation state, that universality presupposes something that is either inclusive to subjects or has points of exclusion and cancellation to the particularity of subjects having to deal with the way they conduct themselves in their everyday lives, their daily social praxis, how they earn a living and things of this nature, and how they belong and how they fund the very institutions that provide these freedoms for them, is all part of this general idea of universality. So you get into the field of where when you get out into the field of, you can have sort of nothing eclipsed but an opening via technology, which is again looked at in another book I wrote called Contemporary Elucidations in Thought. You have the idea that there is an actual ontological algorithm for every individual that becomes part of enters into a sort of synthetic unification with the machine and coordinates something such as analytics. So eventually we will all be, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, instead of this sort of artistic tattoos, you had, a UPC code of some sort, and this is sort of very, a UPC code on your arm, or something to identify you, because carrying all these objects, 50 years down the road, everywhere you go, you're forced to go or choose to go is not going to work with the population growth as it is. So eventually, this is touching on this from the 2010s, and then I believe the Contemporary Elucidations in Thought, I was more toward. It was a 16-year project, and it's not a long book. It's perhaps in total only 148 pages of 50,000 words of text. So it's a quick read, but it tries to bulletproof the idea that that significations are the only things on which you have to rely. You also have to rely on your connections, your point of contact with representations. Representations and signifiers I see as different things. I can see the authenticity of signifiers as actual signifiers as being more part of the real world, whereas representations are connected more into the Kantian world, where we can separate them between, we're able to separate them between empirical objects from the produced society, that phenomena that we see merely as representations, that might be the way of us identifying the others through this phenomena. So one has to, of course, live with this, the phenomena of the objects, the phenomena of the others as empirical objects. Kant had time to do so, not everyone does. But we also have the representations that are contingent, and those are a little more sort of involve a little bit more reflection, and perhaps would even disable the pursuit of a working life. I mean, it's wonderful for writers and things of this nature, and artists. You have the essential idea of, with the aforementioned, this piece, the idea of Husserl and Marx together as a notion of how aesthetics in the economy, how language and logic work together to establish one's ability to articulate oneself in such a way as it makes it is sensible to those that wish to experience it as sensibility, and to experience it as authenticity. And I think if you can just differentiate between sensibility and authenticity, then you're well on your way toward understanding how discourse, in the public discourse, things of this nature, and the privacy one comes to wish for in one's own life, the very things that generate that were once assigned specifically to the notions of, to perhaps even to religion, the private relationship with a private sort of a deity, versus this being completely public. This is the idea that is for them a generalization of their own way of self-identifying. Someone that is experiencing a religio-spiritual epiphany is looking for a private experience rather than a public experience, because to be delivered into sort of public spaces based upon one's own spiritual beliefs is sort of is distilling it into the public mindset. And that is part of all the media culture, and part of all the things available in produced society to be consumed, things of this nature. Between those two books, the Dialectical Self-Concept of Symbolic Being, and the other one that I didn't retrieve but is equally part of this piece, Contemporary Elucidations in Thought, available at Amazon, are a combination of connected yet differing visions. I believe with this piece I was more hedging upon a sort of Frankfurt, the new left is what I called it, really. But my roots are of course in historically reproduced philosophical argumentation and the discourses of from Plato to really Lacan, in a sense, and I hope that this gives some background, and I hope to see you again sometime. Thanks for watching.